Hey everyone, this is Mike, and I wanted to kind of give my opinion on the whole ultimate raiding and counter design, I guess you could call it, because with the release of Alexander Ultimate, even though I was very happy with how most of the fight played out, I'm not so happy with the direction that Ultimate is taking, and not necessarily like how Ultimates are built up, like how they are progressing or something like that, because I think Alexander Ultimate is a fantastic fight and it's probably my favorite out of all three of the Ultimates, but it also has a lot of similarities with the other two Ultimates, which I actually would like to see change a little bit. So when Unending Coil came out, it was of course very new. No, there was no Ultimate before yet, and it was the first time that we had a marathon fight. You're fighting Twin, then Nail, then Bahamut, then the Ad Phase, then Golden Bahamut, and then you finally finished the fight, which was an incredibly long fight. I think it was like 18 minutes or something like that. And it was literally a marathon, and through that fight you had some really cool new mechanics, like for example Nail Deus Darnus with the randomness in her mechanics, and then also her voice lines, which of course a lot of people used ACT, me included. But if they actually would have voice acted that kind of stuff, would be really cool, but I digress. But one of the main staples of the Ultimates has always been the trio mechanics. So when you get to Bahamut, the third phase of UCOB, you get these trios where Bahamut, Nail, and Twin are all doing an attack at the same time. And the first time you see this, it is really cool because it's all very new and very fresh, because old UCOB was that first one that did these kind of mechanics. Then we move on to Ultima, and you get this really cool new concept of waking up the Primals, which I thought was really clever. But then once you get to the Ultima phase, you get these trios again. This time they're called Ultimates, and even though that the trios from Ultima were very different from those from UCOB, because this time you had trios where you mostly had to keep uptime on the boss, which made them a lot more fun for me, but still it is the same concept. And then now we get into Alexander Ultimate, where yet again we are fighting multiple different bosses, and we have these trio mechanics, this time called formations, which 3 out of 4 of the formations were incredibly boring to me. The time stop mechanic was really boring because it was super simple. The Inception phase was literally just a puzzle to figure out, which I guess for the World Proc teams was kind of cool, but also very frustrating because of how cryptic it was. But basically, once you knew what it was a very simple mechanic as well. Wormhole, incredibly difficult. This is probably the one that saved that phase for me. If Wormhole was not a thing, I think Alexander Ultimate would have been way more down on my list of how much I enjoyed this fight. And then the Judgment Trio, or Judgment Formation I believe it's called, where you have Brute Justice doing his J-Waves. That one was very boring again, as well as a DPS and as a tank. As a healer it's probably relatively stressful because you have to like keep everyone alive, but for the most part you're just going to be spamming heals as well. The only thing that was cool about that phase was layering your cooldown, like your defensive mitigation basically. But outside of that, the Alexander Prime phase, if Wormhole wasn't there, it would have been incredibly an incredible letdown for me as a phase as a whole. And that is kind of where I wanted to talk about those things as well. I think trios, even though they were incredibly cool when they were first introduced into UCOB, and then later in Ultima, I was like, okay, they can do this a second time, I don't really mind that much. But now that we're seeing it in Alexander again, I'm kind of seeing that this is probably going to be a trend going forward. Like the next Ultimate will probably have trios again, and the next one as well. And I think it is something that they should break free of. It's kind of like how in Stormblood, the fourth boss would have a second phase after a cutscene, and once you know that it's going to be there, you lose your excitement for it a little bit. Because first time that we saw Neo Exdeath, that was incredibly cool. Like you pushed Exdeath to below, I believe it was like 59%, then all of a sudden this cutscene would start and it's different from the Enrage that you saw last time, and then all of a sudden he gets sucked up into that black hole, and then Neo Exdeath like crawls free from the wall or from the void or whatever that he's coming from. And it was really cool. Now, the problem with that was that we started to expect these kind of things. So when we had Kefka, when we first saw his face in the normal raid, of course, we knew that there was a part of the music missing, and of course that music was used in the Savage version of God Kefka, which God Kefka is probably still my favorite Savage boss to date, because I think it was an incredibly fun fight. But the problem was, again, that also after the halfway point, mechanics started to repeat. For example, if we look at Neo Exdeath, once you hit Grand Cross Omega, you basically only saw repeat mechanics. Same with Kefka, God Kefka, when you do the third, what's it called again? Forsaken? That one repeats itself again as well. The fourth Forsaken is literally just a copy of the third one. And then when we see at Omega, once you go past the second Hello World, you're again just seeing repeat mechanics. And that is something that I didn't really like that much. Now, there are examples of fights that could be ultimates in the game already. And Brute Justice is the big OG fight of that, A8 Savage. You have a fight that was incredibly long, it had multiple bosses, and it also had a lot of different mechanics that stayed different as well. It's not, for example, like the 3 Savage fights I had just talked about, those being the ones from Stormblood, where you have an incredibly long fight with multiple bosses, but they also still kept their different mechanics. The first phase is just that one robot with like the Nisis, I believe they're called, that show up. Then you go into phase 2, where you have all the different ads that you have to manage. Then you have Brute Justice himself, where you have to fight, and you have the robot dances. And then you go into the final fight, where you're against Winged Justice. And that was an incredibly cool fight, and this could have been the original Ultimate. And then we move on to a much more recent example, Titan Savage. I think Titan is actually an incredibly good example of what Ultimate could be when it's just talking about one single boss. If you, for example, look at all the Ultimates right now, it's always been multiple different bosses around a certain theme. For example, Bahamut with then Nail and Twin, then we have Ultima with the 3 Primals, which was all story driven, and then of course we have Alexander with Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser, and then of course Living Liquid is in there as well, but he probably just got put in there because of like PTSD of like the early Gordius days basically. Which was a funny reference to that, but outside of that I don't really think that Living Liquid held any thematical sense, I guess you could say, when it comes to the Alexander raid. But anyways, so we're very used to the multiple bosses in a marathon setting in the Ultimates now, and I would honestly like to see it change to just be one boss like they did with Titan, for example. Reason why I like Titan so much is because it basically shows you that it would be possible for Ultimate to have one boss, multiple phases, and still be a very diverse and an incredibly fun fight. Titan Savage is a very fun fight, and even to this day I still like doing it because there is so many different mechanics in there, and each different phase still keeps its own identity. When you have at phase 1, you have the different jumps that he's doing depending on what mechanics happens first. He's going to do something different afterwards, and it's all about Mini Titan, and then of course like the landslides and the jumps. Phase 2 is all about the uplifts, the different like the red and yellow mechanics, where you have to position, where you have to drop down from the uplifts, and that kind of stuff. And then of course like the halfway cleaves through the arena. And then when it comes to the final phase, that is where you're combining both of them. You now have to mitigate through what Mini Titan is doing, but you also have to use just rate-wide mitigation that is not applied to a boss, like for example Reprisal, Adel, that kind of stuff is just on a boss. But when you look at other mitigation, like for example Shield Samba, Heart of Light, Shake It Off, that kind of stuff can mitigate stuff from Big Titan. So their mitigation becomes a lot more interesting, and you're dealing with both Mini Titans as well Big Titans mechanics at the same time, and you still have that Weight of the Land stuff happening where you have to do the merry-go-round, and then also the red and yellow markers on the players as well, which is incredibly cool. So I really think that Titan Savage, and of course also Brute Justice, is a really good example of what the current Ultimate formula is, like Brute Justice, and what the Ultimate formula could be going forward, which is Titan Savage. And I honestly would like to see something like that happen in the future, where they could just take some of these older fights, like for example, like they did with XDev, Kefka, and then Omega, where they could kind of take that same idea of having different bosses still, but then being a evolution of the previous one, like for example Kefka into God Kefka, MNF into Final Omega, and then of course XDev into Neo XDev, but just cut out the checkpoint and then just go from there, because I really do enjoy these multiple phase fights, which I think Ultimate should still be, but it would be incredibly fun for me that it would change from being these multiple bosses that are going to go into a marathon fight with some trios through the middle and then a cakewalk final phase, well, we shouldn't say cakewalk, but like a victory lap final phase. It would be really cool to see a one boss that maybe has some different forms, like for example Sephiroth could be a really good one as well for that, because I still want to see kind of like a warring triad when it comes to the ultimates, if we are talking about like multiple bosses and stuff like that. But for example, look at Sephiroth. He starts off in his mini form, then he grows big, he has his mega form, and who knows, maybe they can do like something akin to Alexander, where you're fighting mini and mega Sephiroth at the same time, although I don't really think it would make sense. But still, regardless, they could do something where you have mini Sephiroth, and then he grows big, then you're fighting big Sephiroth, and then maybe you like chain him together again into mini Sephiroth phase, which is then the final phase where you have your victory lap or something like that. I really think that would be much more interesting to me, because it would just make it one final fight, or just one boss that you're fighting, and it just feels like one cohesive fight rather than just a marathon of bosses that you are fighting. So that's kind of my opinion on the current ultimate, my kind of dislike of the way how all the ultimates are very similar to each other, in the fact that they are marathon fights with trios involved. And like basically when I saw the trios in Alexander, I was like, oh, here we go again. So I would like to see that kind of change, and maybe just do what they did with Titan Savage and make it so that it is one boss that has multiple phases or multiple appearances, and then just kind of combine that into one big ultimate. Because at first I was thinking, well, if they're just going to do one boss, won't it be too repetitive? But then they made Titan Savage, and they showed that it is possible to just have one boss fight and just one big boss and still make it interesting throughout the different phases. So that's kind of my opinion on that. That's kind of what I would like to see change with Ultimate going forward, as to not make the formula too stale and too repetitive, because once people start expecting stuff from a certain piece of content, things are going to be much more predictable, and then the fun is kind of going to be gone as well. Because if you know, oh yeah, we're gonna see 3 bosses in that phase, and then a final boss that is kind of like your victory lap, you kind of know what to expect, and it is a lot more fun to fight the unexpected. So that's kind of going to be it for me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.